My name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I'm the host of Reformed GGA, and today I'm here to do an update video on the PSA second video, I went ahead and talked about my initial shooting impressions of the gun in its stock configuration, and for the most part it was, okay. No major problems, no major hiccups. But now I have been able to put more rounds to the gun, still not a ton, but 500, so not inconsequential either. So I can talk a little bit more about the reliability of the gun, and also I upgraded a few parts. As you can see, it does not have the original black classic polymer furniture on there anymore. I made some changes to suit my tastes, and so I thought I'd cover those as well. Now the main part, the important part, well, depends on who you are, I guess, but the part that I'm going to say is probably more important is, of course, the reliability. 500 rounds down the pipe now. What's the reliability like? Any malfunctions, any hiccups, any problems? Yes, but I am somewhat happy to report that they're user error type malfunctions. In terms of the gun doing what it's supposed to do, it does that just fine, but that doesn't mean I didn't have no hiccups whatsoever. I installed a different trigger on this one. As you can see, it has the ALG trigger in there. And that trigger is nice and light, and it's shorter than a normal AK trigger. It's about half of the total travel as a normal AK trigger, which is great. And also it doesn't have nearly as much trigger slap as a normal AK trigger, which again is great. A lot of people like that. The problem though for me is that when I'm trying to run the gun fast, I'm used to having the normal AK trigger slap, and that is kind of my reference point for the reset. This one, while it does have some trigger slap, it's not nearly as pronounced, and so I found myself not shooting to reset properly. I release just a little bit, but not enough to actually reset the trigger, and start pulling again, and of course nothing would happen because the trigger hadn't reset yet, and nothing happens when you do that. So it kind of seemed like a dead trigger, but it wasn't. It was just I didn't let the trigger go out for reset. So that's a user caused malfunction, and that happened a number of times, but all I had to do again was just release the trigger fully and pull again, and it was good to go. There was also one time when I had hammer follow, and that does happen for me with almost every gun. If I'm running the gun fast enough, eventually I'll outrun the gun, and I'll get it so that the hammer follows the bolt home instead of waiting for the bolt to come home first and then releasing the hammer. I'll release it just as the hammer is going forward, and of course when it does that, it doesn't have nearly enough momentum to set off a cartridge, and so you get a dead trigger, and you have to cycle the gun through the round that came out. I put back through it, and it ran just fine, no problems, but those are both human caused problems. That's not the gun doing anything wrong, it's user caused. So failing to shoot to reset, guilty. Hammer follow, guilty. But as far as the gun is concerned, it did everything just fine. Now, in previous videos, I did mention that I do preemptively fix some things on the Palmetto State Armory AKs in general. After what the problems that I had with the GF3 when I first got it, I just don't trust them to get the tolerances right between the bolt carrier and the top of the hammer. And so I go in and I manually adjust that by filing some things down, and I've talked about that more extensively in other videos. And I did the same thing here, and I also did the same thing even with the ALG trigger hammer. Same thing, just to make sure that I don't have any problems with that. And as far as the gun is concerned, runs beautifully, it runs fine. No issues there, seems to do what it's supposed to do, and no qualms about that. Granted, 500 rounds isn't as much as I would like as far as a reliability test is concerned, but what it shows is that at least it's on track for what you would expect for a normal AK. It's doing what an AK should do. Yes, there were some user-caused errors and whatnot, but the gun is doing what it should do at this point, and so far, no major cause for alarm, no major hiccups that would really be worth noting at all. Like I said, failing to reset the trigger, and hammer follow. Only issues that happen, those are both human-caused errors, and those are preventable. So not a big issue. In terms of the upgrades that I made, I basically got some furniture on it to match more or less my other AK, my GF3. My GF3 has more or less the same furniture complement, except it's in gray, where this one is in FDE, but more or less got it to match that. And the main reason why, I've discussed this in the previous videos, is just that I didn't like that black classic polymer furniture that the AK-103 came with. I know why Palmetto State Armory did it. They were going for a particular look to make it look like an AK-103, even though the gun really isn't an AK-103. At its heart, it's an AKM with a few AK-103-esque feature. It has the the U-model gas block with a 90-degree gas port. It has a little bit different front sight, and it also has a improved, well, I would say improved, but at least different muzzle device than most of their AKs generally come with. So those are great advantages. They're all wonderful things, but the main action part of the gun, the receiver, the bolt carrier, the bolts, all those kinds of things, they're standard AKM stuff. So it's an AK-103 with a few modifications to the front end, but still, so far, a very good gun. And I wanted it to be functional for me, so I got some furniture that I felt was more functional than the classic polymer furniture that they put on it. So I went again with the MOE Handguard, and the main reason for that is that it is a little bit more built up than the standard polymer furniture. It helps keep you away from the burning bits, and it also does have M-LOK slots on the sides and on the bottom. That allows me to mount a little bit of pick rail so that I can put a white light on it if I decide to use the gun for home defense purposes. Having a white light is a good idea. There are other handguards out there that are perfectly acceptable, perfectly fine, and usually quite good. The problem is sometimes availability isn't great with them. They can also be a little expensive, and depending on the model you get, sometimes they can be really heavy and add a lot of forward weight to the gun. And AKs are already kind of forward heavy to begin with, so I didn't want to do that. The AK MOE grips do add a little bit of weight, but not a ton, and they do offer the features that I wanted, especially being able to put pick rail on it, and give me a little bit more hand protection, not a ton, but a little bit more hand protection, all at a fairly affordable price. It was like 40 bucks or something like that. This is not a commercial for Magpul, by the way. I don't like everything that they've done. For example, their CZ Scorpion magazines, I have not had the best luck with. Now, eventually, I think that they'll get them right, and I think they may have already improved the new batch that was coming out, but the early batch of CZ Scorpion magazines that they came out with, I didn't like. They caused malfunctions, and it was a little disappointing for Magpul on that. But these MOE handguards for AKs seem to work just fine, and I haven't had any problems with them since, so far, I should say. Not since, but so far. So, yeah, I'm perfectly fine with it. There are other products out there that are wonderful and good, but this was available at the price point that I wanted for the feature set that I wanted, so hey, why not? The hand grip here, the pistol grip I should say, is one of the MOE Plus grips. Of course, this is an AK model, so it's the MOE AK Plus from Magpul. I'm not a huge fan of these rubberized ones just because they tend to be inconsistent when you expose them to different things. Like gun oil will, of course, make them very slick, which oil tends to do. Water will make them slick, mud, all those kinds of things. I find that the plastic grips are a little bit more consistent because they rely on stippling for their grip, whereas the rubber, if you get anything on the rubber, well then, yeah, it's not going to be so grippy anymore. So it's not quite ideal in that, but the reason why I got it is because it was thicker than the pistol grip that was on here before, which I found was just a little too thin. And when I high carried it, or when I did kind of a patrol carry, it just kind of dug into the hand in weird ways, and I didn't like that. It wasn't a bad grip. It was entirely functional, but just given that I tend to carry the gun around a lot instead of sling it, it caused problems. So I went with a grip that was a little bit wider. I like the overall contours of the Magpul grips. They're not bad. I would have preferred not the rubberized one, but this was what was in stock at the time in the color that would match the color scheme, so I was like, meh, close enough. And, I don't really plan on oiling my grips very often, and I don't plan on throwing the gun in mud puddles all that often. Not that it's, not fun in some certain circumstances, but still. not what I plan on doing, so it'll be functional enough for me. It's no secret that I like the Zhukov stocks as well. They definitely have their downsides. One of the biggest ones is that when you extend them all the way out, you'll get some rotation of the foot of the stock, or the butt of the stock. So they can be a little spindly when you take them all the way out. But as long as you have them relatively close, they're not bad. And there's a little bit of play there, but not much at all. It's very much so usable. But what I like about them is that they're basically in line with the rest of the gun, and so that tends to help with recoil control and management and muzzle rise management. And on top of that, they also are a right side folder, and on a gun with an optic on it, that is a real advantage. There's lots of ways you can mount optics to AKs. Some people would disagree, but there actually are quite a few ways to mount optics to AKs. You can do things that attach to the gas tube. You can do things that replace or go into the rear sight block. And then what I prefer is the side rails. If you have an AK with a side rail on it, there's a few, not a ton, but a few very good side rail manufacturers and places that make pretty good optics for 7.62x39, and those are usually best done with, of course, that side mount, that side rail. Unfortunately, the AK-103 clones that are out there usually have a left folding classic polymer stock, and that's fine. It completes the look. I know why people do it and why people like it. It looks cool. You know, it looks like an AK-103 looks, and it has that kind of aesthetic to it. But me, I am much more concerned with function over form, and that's why I have the things on it that I have. I'm not saying that they're the most functional that is out there, but at least more functional than what it came with. And that left folding stock would get in the way, or rather the optic mount would get in the way of a left folding stock, and I'd have to take the optic off in order to fold it. But the Zhukov, because it is a right folder, I don't have that issue. I can leave the optic mounted on there and it doesn't cause any problems. It's great. Oh, also worth mentioning, Magpul does have these little cheek risers that fit on top of their Magpul stocks. They just snap in place. I will say that a lot of the sizes that they make them in are utterly useless. They make like a 1/4 inch one and a 1/2 inch one. I have found that at least if you're going to use this kind of a setup for your optic, where you're using the side rail and mounting it that way, the 1/4 inch one and the 1/2 inch one are just useless. The 3/4 inch one is where it's at, I'm telling you. But it does have the cheek risers available. Then as far as the optic combo is concerned, I took a page out of Rob Ski's book and decided that I would go with the Primary Arms 3X Prism Scope. Those of you guys who followed my channel for a while know that I originally had this on the KS-47, which is basically an AR that's just been rechambered in 7.62x39. That particular gun was only a 10.5 inch barrel gun. It was relatively short, relatively small. It didn't make much sense to have a 1-pound optic on it. I liked it, it was fine, but it was just bigger and bulkier than what that gun really merited, so I wound up going with a red dot for that gun. And the 3X Prism Scope has now gone over to the AK, and I personally think it's a much better fit for that. One downside that I did find to this while shooting it yesterday is the day that I put most of the rounds on the gun. First time I took it out, I put like 90 rounds on it. This next time I took it out, I put like 110 rounds on it. And then yesterday I put about 300 rounds through it, so a total of 500. And most of those rounds were with this optic on it. And it does really good in most circumstances, except in Idaho. Depending on the time of the year and the weather conditions, it can be extremely bright out here in the southern Idaho desert. And the so-called daylight bright settings on this optic, because it does have an illumination mode on the reticle, you can either leave it as the etch reticle, which is just basically black, or you can turn on the illumination and it will illuminate it with red. And the two top settings, setting 10 and 11, are supposed to be daylight bright, but I found that out here, not so much. Yesterday, I was having an extremely hard time connecting with anything at any great distance. I had target set up at 200 yards, but I did not hit it very often. And the main problem that I was having is that They were black targets, and this thing I couldn't get bright enough to actually have a red reticle. Instead it just looked black, and so I have black reticle on black target, and yeah, good luck doing any kind of precision shooting with that. You know, if you're talking about man-sized targets at 200 yards with this thing, it's not a problem. But if you're trying to do any kind of precision work, and our weather conditions out here with as bright as it can be, it wasn't so great. That would be its one drawback. But in terms of everything else about it, you know, if weather conditions are otherwise, or as long as your targets aren't dark targets, they're lighter targets, it is perfectly functional and fine. It's not a big deal that way. The mount that is on it is the master mount that the AK Operator Union store sells, and I found this thing to be very beefy. I like it. When it gets dialed in, this thing is incredibly strong. Most of the time I've been using the RS Regulate mounts, which are great mounts, but they tend to be a little flexible, and so I don't like to put heavy optics on them. This thing, though, is beastly, and so I don't mind putting a 1-pound optic on there, or even more than that I would be perfectly fine with, because it is a beast of a mount, and it locks up very, very, very solidly. Now, for people who don't know about these mounts, these side rail mounts for AKs, they do kind of have to be broken in. There's lots of people that will get them on the gun, get the gun all zeroed in, and then they take apart the gun to clean it, and of course take this off, and then put it all back together and go out and shoot again, and they'll notice that they're way off. Well, that's not because these mounts lose zero. That's what a lot of people think. What it is that they have to be broken in. This is, you know, a metal part that's sliding on another metal part, the rail that's on the gun. Go ahead and bring that back up. This rail on the gun is what that slides on. It slides back and forth, and under recoil, there's going to be a little bit of side-to-side movement. And then you just taking it on and off, it means that there's going to be some back and forth movement. And those metal parts are going to wear on each other, and it will cause some looseness. And that's why all of these mounts are adjustable. So this one in particular underneath has a little hex head that you can move around, and you have to push in on it, and then you move the head around to tighten it up or loosen it up. And as the gun basically breaks in, or rather the connection breaks in, you're going to have to do some adjusting for the first few hundred rounds. After a while, though, the parts will start to mate up, and there won't be much movement after a given point. But you'll have to keep tightening it down for a while. It's just the normal process that these things go through. And is that a pain? Yes, it is, honestly. But like I said, after a few hundred rounds, these things usually get worn in pretty well, and you can accelerate the process just simply by sitting there one day, taking on and off the mount to wear in those parts a little bit faster, and eventually you'll find a point where they just mesh up and things stop moving and you don't have to tighten up anymore, and it will be fine and it will return to zero just fine. Yesterday I was shooting quite a few different groups. Like I said, I was having problems with sunlight and the reticle not being bright enough, but it wasn't really a problem up close. I couldn't get my 200-yard shot, which was a pain. But up close, it was just fine. And so I decided to test the mount and see, you know, if it would lose zero on me. And I had no problems with it. There was a number of groups that I shot where I would literally take the mount on and off every single shot. And those groups, taking the mount on and off every single shot. Okay, so fire a group, take off the mount, put it back on, fire a shot, take off the mount, put it back on, fire a shot. 5 rounds later, those groups were in the same place and the same size as the groups where I just left the mount alone. It doesn't change anything as long as you keep on that tension and keep up on that tension, and you realize that there's going to be a break-in period. Okay, so don't expect to get your gun perfectly sighted in out of the box. No, go out and basically get a rough zero with it, go plink with it, go have fun. It's an AK, burn through some ammo. You know, be an American, which sounds weird. You have an AK, go be American. Yeah. Alright, so, but go out, have some fun with it, allow the parts to wear on each other a little bit, tighten it up, wear on a little bit more, tighten it up, wear it a little bit more, and then it'll break in, and then after that, a few hundred rounds, it'll be good to go, and you'll be just fine. And this thing mounts super solid. I cannot get any movement on it whatsoever. It is wonderful. which is exactly what I like. So it's nice and tight. And like I said, the groups that I shot with taking it on and off every single shot were not functionally different in any significant way from the groups that I shot with it all in one place. It's just fine. All right. And then last couple of modifications, I got a different safety on it. This is the Krebs Enhanced Safety with the locking notch. I love this safety. I can take the bolt back and I can actually lock it in place. That has a few different advantages. One is if there's a malfunction, which shouldn't happen very often with your AK, if it does, instead of getting another safety to help you clear malfunctions, which is what I'm talking about, you probably want to just get the AK fixed and make it run right. But but in the case that you do have a malfunction, because even in a properly working gun you will get malfunctions. There is such a thing as mistakes with ammo and stuff like that, and you can get malfunctions because of that. And having a way to lock open the gun so that you can mess with whatever you need to mess with in there is helpful. Also, there are some ranges that require you to lock the bolt back and show clear, which normally with AKs is very difficult to do, but if you have a locking notch on your safety, it's pretty easy to do. And then my preferred reason for having this thing on there is it allows the barrel to breathe. AKs, of course, have an extremely thin barrel, shooting a 7.62 by 39 projectile. It can heat up pretty quickly, and you can also get some shot dispersion because of that heat. And a lot of people don't like thin barrels because of that. They heat up quickly and you can lose your accuracy pretty quickly because of that. However, if you can let it breathe between groups and you get some kind of airflow going through that barrel, it can cool off pretty quickly. And I live out here in Idaho. One of our chief exports is wind. All that I basically have to do to cool off my barrel is lock it back, set it either angled or upright in a place that has decent airflow, which is very easy to find around here, and the barrel will cool off very quickly. What I would do is I'd usually shoot a 5-round group, go up and check the targets. Most of my shots wound up being at 50 or 100 yards because yesterday was not a good shooting day in terms of the brightness of the sun, in terms of wind, and a host of other issues, and of course me just not being a great shot to begin with. But most of my shots wound up being 50 or 100 yards, and so I'd walk up, check the target after a 5-shot group, and by the time I'd come back, the barrel would be cool enough that I could touch it with my finger and not have any great concerns. It would be warm-ish, but I wouldn't even say that it's hot. My tolerance for heat is fairly low, and I actually found that a lot of guys' tolerance for heat is relatively low. Around 160, 180 is about the warmest that I'll tolerate as far as heat. But this, with leaving the chamber open and just letting it sit there and breathe for a while I went up and checked targets, was enough to keep it tolerable. It was enough to keep it to the point where I could touch it with my finger and not have any significant problems. So great for that. Keeps the heat stress on the gun down, and it allows me to continue firing throughout the day without worrying about the barrel getting super hot. Now, granted, if you do mag dumps, mag dump after mag dump, that kind of thing, yeah, that'll cause problems. But if you can give it a chance to breathe in between groups, and the groups aren't too large, and you have a little bit of airflow, some kind of wind on the day, you can really help that out. So it is a very nice little upgrade. And then last but certainly not least is that wonderful ALG trigger. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of modifying triggers on guns in general. I've had guns where triggers broken, and of course I've replaced them, parts of the trigger assembly and whatnot, but I usually don't go out of my way to get the latest and greatest super light trigger that's out there. Most of the time I replace it either with stock components or with some upgraded components. They're not any lighter, just bigger and beefier so that it doesn't break again kind of thing. That's usually what I do with the triggers. But when it comes to the ALG trigger, I have a little bit different philosophy, and the main reason is just simply because when I ask the question why not with an AK, I can't come up with a terribly good reason for not putting the ALG trigger in. It is a very cheap trigger as triggers go. A lot of times trigger jobs will, well, at least the components will cost you, $50, $100, sometimes $200 plus. This one is only $65, which is definitely on the lower end of the scale. And then in terms of getting the work done, well, I can work on AKs. I've done it several times. I can do it. It's something I can do myself just fine, and it doesn't take a whole lot of finesse or skill. It's pretty easy to do. Just to give you a brief description of it, it's basically you take the legs of the hammer spring and wrap them around the hammer. Take out the retaining plates, which PSA guns have. Other guns will have a little kind of shepherd's crook pin thing in there. But take the retaining plate out, get a punch, and it's a fairly big punch because the pins holes are fairly large. Doesn't really even have to be proper gunsmithing punches, just kind of general tool punches. Knock a couple of pins out, pull out the old trigger components, trigger and hammer components, put the new ones in. You will have to transfer the spring from the old hammer onto the new hammer, but that's not overly difficult. So transfer the hammer, put the new components in, put the pins back in, put the plate retaining plate back on, test for fit and function, and you're good to go. And that's another thing about these ALG triggers as well, is that they seem to work very well in these PSA rifles. So far, they fit in every PSA rifle that I've had them in terms of PSA AKs. Worked just fine in the GF3, worked just fine in the AKP, now works just fine in the AK-103. I have not tested them yet in the AKV. I do have an AKV, but I never put an ALG in it. So I'm not sure what would all be entailed there. If there's any issues, it would probably be with that one, and I do remember. The standard ALG trigger will not work in an AKV. You need, there's a modification that they make, but it has to be for the AKV modification. It has to be for AKs and 9mm, specifically, just because there's some different geometry with the bolt that they have in there, because that one is blowback operated instead of having a gas system like a regular AK, and so the bolt's a little bit different. So that one is different. That one that's a whole different little thing right there. But otherwise, they fit in there just fine. Like I said, they're cheap, they're easy to install. Why not? And this one is very, very, very nice. Let's pull. In terms of measuring from the bottom of the trigger, there's about 2 millimeters of take up where you're just pushing the hammer spring up, which also functions as a return trigger spring in an AK. Okay, so we move the hammer spring up, and now you get a little bit of resistance because you're starting to slide on the hammer plates. The hook, the trigger hook is starting to move off of the hammer plate, and there isn't really a defined wall. Like on AKs, there isn't really a defined wall anyways. It just kind of breaks somewhere in there. So there's kind of like 2 millimeters of pre-travel, 1 millimeter of transition, and then about 2 millimeters until the break. So 5 millimeters total, measuring from the bottom of the trigger. Of course, your finger is going to be higher up, so depending on how high you have your finger, that might be different. But fairly short trigger. It reminds me a lot in terms of length of an AK trigger. AKs will have roughly that much travel as well, but of course a standard AK trigger is considerably heavier. So it has the same length of pull as a lot of AK triggers, a lot of AR triggers do. But it is a much lighter pull weight. So, like I said, why not? It's easy to install, it's cheap, might as well. Is it essential? Absolutely not. The normal AK trigger that PSA puts out with their AKs is perfectly functional and fine. I've never had any problems with them, but it's $65 and it takes like 15 minutes to install, so why not? You know, it's like I said, I don't really get into new trigger jobs, but with AKs it's just so easy to do and it's so fun. Why not? And then I guess while we're at it, we might as well do a reset here. Alright, so releasing, and you do get just a tiny bit of trigger slap. There is an audible click. You can feel it just a little bit let off. There's almost no over travel. And the same thing in reverse. When I pull the trigger back, there's maybe a 0.5 millimeter, maybe 1/4 millimeter over travel on the back end, but it's not really enough to worry about. And the same thing on the front end. yeah, that is my hang up with this trigger, is that the return is not as tactile and audible as I would like it to be, and that's why sometimes I get problems where I think I'm doing a trigger pull when I'm not, because I haven't reset the trigger, that kind of thing. Have problems with resetting the trigger when they're this light. Not quite as well defined on the reset as I would prefer, or at least as what I'm used to with other standard triggers. But other than that, great little trigger. Like I said, almost no over travel in either direction. Of course, very light. This one on my digital Lyman scale comes in at 2 pounds 1 ounce. That was the 3-pull average, so pretty light. And of course, this is after several hundred rounds through it. When it started out, it was closer to about 2 1/4 pounds. So it has lightened up a little bit with use, but great trigger. I just need to learn how to go to reset properly on it, because I'm used to other triggers that are quite a bit longer and have a much more defined reset point. There's a lot more trigger slap on a standard AK trigger, and I'm used to that doing the resetting work for me, basically. Release it enough to get trigger slap and you're good. Doesn't really happen with this one, because there is trigger slap, but it's not nearly as defined. But that's just a matter of getting used to the trigger. That's not a problem with the gun or problem with the trigger. It's just me getting used to the way that it works. So that is the AK-103 500 round update. In terms of malfunctions, only user caused malfunctions. In terms of upgrades, nothing super spectacular, but everything here I would say is better than the stock configuration that they come in with, that black polymer furniture. And it is a very enjoyable, fun gun to shoot. I am really enjoying it. And when I can finally get out there on a day that is actually conducive to doing some real accuracy testing, I'll give you what that is. So far, my best group with the gun has been 2.5 inches at 100 yards, which is nothing super great to write home about, but it should be noted that when I got that group, it was with the Wolf Military Classic 124 grain full metal jacket load. And so not the best ammo at all. It's very much so bulk ammo. And 2.5 inches with bulk ammo, that's acceptable, especially given that it's a chrome line barrel, and chrome line barrels usually are not as accurate as other barrels are. So I will definitely take that all day long. If I could find a decent load for it, I could probably, I don't think I could cut that in half, but I bet you I could get it at least under 1 3/4, maybe under 1.5. But definitely sub 2 MOA. If I'm getting 2 1/4 with junk ammunition, sorry, 2.5 with junk ammunition, I bet you I can at least get under 2, probably under 2 3/4 with at least halfway decent ammunition. But I still have yet to actually really test that in full. So far, I've basically just been plinking with it, breaking in the side rail on the scope. Later on, when conditions are more conducive, we'll do some actual serious accuracy testing and see what we get, but so far 2.5 MOA. Anyways, I've yammered on enough. Thank you all for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.